The 10th Sunday after Trinity. Let thy merciful ears, O Lord, be open to the prayers of your people across the earth, and that they may obtain petitions, make them to ask those things that are right, and as such shall please you, through our omnipotent Redeemer, Jesus. Amen. Well, we're looking at hymn 672, verse 1. Looks to me like a quasi-commentary on the Nicene Creed, but we'll see. O very God of very God, and very light of light, whose feet this earth's dark valley trod, that so it might be bright. We turn our attention to Professor Darryl Hart, his book. He's a scholar on Old Princeton and scholar on Professor Gresham Machen, and a very good historian. His PhD, I think, I'm not sure it was from either John Hopkins University or Harvard, as memory serves. In the preface, the book is about J. Gresham Machen, the Scion. It's Scion. I need to learn how to pronounce it. I read it all the time, but I never say it. Nobody in my orbit says it. Of a prominent and genteel Baltimore family who studied at the finest American and European universities, and while teaching at Princeton went on to become one of the United States' leading authorities in New Testament studies. This side of Machen's life is not as well known as his involvement in the fundamentalist controversy of the 1920s. A devout Presbyterian, Machen railed against the infidelities of theological modernists and eventually left the Protestant establishment to found a new seminary and denomination. This capsule summary of Machen's career highlights a number of anomalies that make him an interesting object of study. I'm just thinking here, Machen was New Testament. He taught Woodhouse. I forget his name now. New Testament man. And then Dick Gaffin. So he's really a great-grandfather. A great-grandpa, lineally for me. Great-grandpa, theologically, confessionally. I'm out of Westminster Seminary. I'm one of its offspring. He was known as a gentleman and scholar, two traits not associated with militancy, stridency, and populism of fundamentalism, even in recent revisionist accounts of the movement. Explaining how a privileged and learned Protestant became embroiled in the religious disputes of the 1920s is one purpose of this book. To understand Machen's involvement in the fundamentalist modernist controversy, we need to locate the religious conflict over America's churches and schools in the broader intellectual and cultural climate of the 1920s, a climate that cultivated dissatisfaction with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethos of American culture generally and the tenor of Protestant life specifically. A variety of conservative intellectuals, from the New Humanists to the Southern agrarians, denounced the modernizing drift of mainstream Protestantism. Machen's criticism of liberal Protestantism echoed many of these complaints. To be sure, he attracted a following within fundamentalist circles, one that had all but dried up by the time of his premature death in 1937. But his attraction for fundamentalists should not obscure Machen's identity as a conservative intellectual who opposed religious modernism for reasons having as much to do with his academic training and social background as with his Presbyterian convictions. Nor should it conceal his identity as a Presbyterian traditionalist who championed Calvinistic creeds and reform patterns of church government against the innovations of fundamentalists and modernists alike. A further anomaly about Machen was his unique critique of mainstream Protestantism was received by secular intellectuals. The support he garnered from prominent members of the liberal intelligentsia, a surprising twist in the fundamentalist controversy, reveals a puzzling and limited, but nonetheless genuine allegiance during the 1920s between orthodox belief and liberalism. Machen was by no means representative on this score, but his critique of liberal Protestantism was a religious expression of the post-World War I attack upon America's religious and cultural establishment, what one historian called the rebellion against Victorianism. Of course, Machen's reasons for opposing the Protestant establishment differed from those of secularists. Nevertheless, unlike fundamentalist and modernist Protestants, Machen fully rejected the hope of building a Christian civilization in America, and so found himself on the side with other secular intellectuals in many of the cultural conflicts of the 1920s. A study of Machen's thought and career, therefore, has much to tell us, not just about the issues that unsettled, some would say unseated, mainstream Protestantism's hold on American intellectual and cultural life, but it also offers a distinctive and revealing perspective on the way we've come to assess and locate religion, science, and modernity in the 20th century. Having said that, let me just go back here. This particular volume is published by John Hopkins University Press and came out in 1994. Some acknowledgments. I began this book in 1985. Since that time, my dear wife, I think he just finished his master's at Westminster, and he was at Westminster roughly in the time when yours truly was there. Since that time, my dear wife, Anne, has been a constant source of support, encouragement, and good sense. Her affection has tempered the disappointments and enriched the satisfactions of academic life. As a partial payment, I dedicate this to her. I'm also grateful for assistance, both financial and intellectual, from the Department of History at John Hopkins University, where this project started. Sounds like his doctor. I think he did his doctorate at John Hopkins in Baltimore, where this project started. Wheaton College and Pew Charitable Trusts provided general support to the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, which allowed me to complete revisions. An additional grant from Wheaton College's Aldine Faculty Development Fund subsidized the completion of the index. Timothy L. Smith deserves special mention for his careful reading, astute criticism, and wise counsel, both as an advisor in graduate school and friend since. Mark Knoll's guidance, encouragement, we're going to read Mark Knoll, God willing, on Princeton theology, have been indispensable to this book and my understanding of American Protestantism. Among the other readers who provided many helpful comments along the way were Ronald Walters, John Higham, George Marsden, that's another man that we needed to kind of track down, Henry Stout is a church historian, William Hutchinson, Richard B. Gaffin, my father, lineally and theologically at Westminster, very careful, Reformed New Testament scholar who thinks extremely highly of Prof. Hart, Jeffrey Charles, and David Watton for virtually unlimited access to Machen papers at the Montgomery Library in Westminster, and for their friendship. And many thanks go to John Muther, Grace Millen, and Jane Pottet. Thanks also goes to the John Hopkins University Press and especially to Robert Brugger for his patience and steadying advice in seeing the project through to publication. Well, we turn to the introduction. Now we're into the text, beginning on page 1. By most accounts, and it's entitled Religion and Cultural Modernism in America. By most accounts, post-World War I era in American history witnessed the splintering of religion from cultural and intellectual life. According to one recent assessment, intellectuals in the 1920s came to regard religion as alien to their endeavors because the prevailing outlook among intellectuals was cosmopolitan and irreligious. This verdict only repeats what contemporaries believed. More than 60 years ago, in 1931, describing the revolt of the highbrows. That's quite the term there, the revolt of the highbrows. Frederick Lewis Allison summarized the credo of the country's writers, artists, and intellectuals. The word credo is an important word. Credo is from the Latin credum. Credere means to believe, I believe. And as we started to study in Prof. Philip Schaff's book, Creeds of Christendom, we made the point earlier this morning that everybody, without exception or exemption, has a creed. It needs to be established. So that's on a personal level. What do I believe? What does my family believe? What does my church believe? What do those who are outside the church believe? So the word credo is important. Don't believe everybody who's scientific doesn't have a creed. He has a creed too. Back to our good professor, Frederick Lewis. Here, these restless souls promoted sexual freedom, deified property, opposed prohibition, took pleasure in overturning popular idols, and in general were religious skeptics. Never before, Allen wrote, had so many books addressed to the thinking public assumed at the outset that their readers had rejected the old theology. The chief Tom beater on the offensive, Prof. Hart, has some beautiful expressions. In Allen's judgment was the Baltimore journalist and editor H.L. Mencken, for whom rebellion was the breath of life. Mencken derided almost every convention of America's middle class, from the religion of Coolidge prosperity to the sentimentality and idealism of polite literature. According to Walter Lippmann, himself an important member of America's secular intelligentsia, Mencken was the most powerful personal influence on the whole generation of educated people. What Allen failed to recognize was that despite the highbrow's antipathy toward religion, the void created by the lapsing of the belief still absorbed the attention of many intellectuals, including Mencken and Lippmann. Just before the appearance of Allen's Only Yesterday, for instance, Lippmann published a preface to Morals, 1929, and Mencken followed with a treatise on the gods. To be sure, neither Lippmann nor Mencken embraced the Protestant values that therefore had dominated American culture and institutions. Yet both authors confronted what they considered a central problem in modern American society, the loss of traditional beliefs in the face of widespread cultural change. For Lippmann, the problem of modern unbelief was without precedent. This is the first stage, he wrote, when the circumstances of life have conspired with the intellectual habits of the time to render any fixed and authoritative belief incredible to large masses of men. The predicament haunted Lippmann, for it meant that Whirl was king, that modern men and women no longer possessed certain foundations for moral and spiritual ideals. Debunker that he was, Mencken was less troubled by Lippmann, by the loss of religious certainty, and more eager to mock the superstitions still prevalent in rural America. Nevertheless, even Mencken sounded at least a trifle concerned about the skepticism embraced by the educated. What survives under the name of Christianity above the stratum of the mob is no more than a sort of humanism with little more supernaturalism in it than you will find in mathematics or political economy. Prof. Hart is just gold. Such words, though betraying anxiety about the loss of religion, were hardly consoling to the leaders of America's Protestant churches. For almost half a century, theologians and clergy of various denominations had been overhauling Protestant beliefs, hoping to appropriate new directions in the intellectual world in order to preserve the allegiance of the very people for whom Mencken and Lippmann professed to speak. Now they were being told that the whole project of refashioning Christianity in modern garb had failed. Reactions to Mencken and Lippmann from prominent Protestants were predictable. Reinhold Niebuhr dismissed Mencken for telling, quote, little more than how one fanatic feels about other fanatics of a different type. Whoa, that's a thrusted parry with a sword to the side of Lippmann. Wow. Stop and just let that sink in. Reinhold Niebuhr, the Neo-Orthodox theologian. Lippmann provoked a deeper response. George A. Gordon, a prominent Boston Congregationalist, complained that Lippmann had, quote, everywhere overdone the modern loss of certainty. Meanwhile, the popular preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick was irritated enough by Lippmann to accuse him of being a closet fundamentalist. The only religion Lippmann could understand, Fosdick snapped, quote, was the most naive and medieval sort. Lippmann was not at home with any intelligent religion since the deism of the 18th century went to pieces. Oh, these guys are slashing and burning, man. Whoa. Fosdick was a Baptist liberal himself in some ways. Fosdick's rejoinder to Lippmann touched a little-noticed irony that accompanied the breach between religious leaders and intellectuals in the 1920s. One stimulus to books such as Lippmann's and Mencken's was their perception that modern Protestantism was intellectually bankrupt. According to Lippmann, and how can you say that in the early 20th century? Really? Of course, the rank and file are not going to be scholars and theologians. We expect that. But there's a tremendously rich heritage, even in the 19th century, theologically. According to Lippmann, the faith of mainstream Protestants was incapable of supplying the certainty modern culture needed. Something quite fundamental is left out of the modernist creeds, he wrote. They reject revelation, the authority of any particular church, and the inspiration of the Bible. In sum, modern Protestantism had lost the conviction that religion comes from God. Mencken spoke in similar terms. The effort to reconcile Protestantism and modern learning had reduced Christianity to a vague sort of goodwill to men, with little more clout in the wider world than abstract notions such as justice or nostalgic claims about the love of God. While I'm on this, he's talking about these academic, I'm not academic, he's talking about these critics of mainstream Philip Schaff would call it evangelical Protestantism in his late 19th, early 20th century work. We're talking about Lippmann and Machen. What were their academic credentials in theology? That's a very serious question. We need to look that up. Machen spoke in similar terms. The irony in such criticisms as Fosdick perceived was that Lippmann and Machen, themselves resolutely modern, were echoing the opinions of Protestant fundamentalists. By faulting the leaders of the Protestant churches for abandoning the traditional tenets of Christianity, secular intellectuals were in fact advancing the fundamentalist argument that Protestant modernism compared poorly with historic doctrinal Christianity. That's a fact. Cursa Blake, I think, or was it Shirley K. Jackson? One of those two at the University of Chicago said, the fundamentalists haven't left the faith, it is we, the liberals, who've left the ancient historic faith. That's just a statement of historical fact. I want to do more examination of Protestant liberalism in the 20th century. The possibility that America's secular intelligentsia might join Protestant fundamentalists in a wartime alliance against mainstream Protestantism now sounds far-fetched. At the time, however, it was not. For in mounting their attack on modernizing Protestantism, Lippmann and Machen both cited with approval the opinions of the fervent fundamentalist J. Gresham Machen. Machen, a respected New Testament scholar and professor since 1906 at the West Point of Presbyterian Orthodoxy in 1906, and he calls it the West Point of Orthodoxy. I like that. That's pretty powerful. Princeton Theological Seminary had come to the attention of these cultural savants because of his outspoken opposition to Protestant liberalism. To Lippmann and Machen, though he spoke from the opposite end of the religious spectrum, had yet made criticisms of liberalism what they found cogent. Machen had become something of a celebrity, and with the publication in 1923 of his Christianity and Liberalism, there he argued that by denying the supernatural character of Christianity, liberal Protestants had actually created an entirely new religion. It was precisely this argument that Lippmann praised in his preface to Morals for its acumen, saliency, and wit. I did not know that. I knew Mencken had come to respect Machen as a Protestant intellectual, as an old school man. I didn't know Lippmann did, and I didn't know both these men sided with Machen's view, even though they weren't, as I understand it, theological supporters of Machen. For Lippmann, Machen had provided a cool and stringent defense of traditional Protestantism, quote, the best popular argument, close quote, produced by either fundamentalists or liberals in a decade of religious turmoil. Machen was no less surprised. To readers of the American Mercury, he introduced the person he would later dub Dr. Fundamentalist as a man of great learning and dignity, a former student at European universities, the author of various valuable books, and a member of several societies of savants. In this instance, at least, Mencken had abandoned hyperbole for straight journalism, for Machen was decidedly not a typical fundamentalist. He had trained at John Hopkins University. He's talking about Machen. John Hopkins, Princeton Seminary, Princeton University, the German universities of Marburg and Göttingen. I wonder if he had any contact with Rudolf Bultmann at Marburg. Through his involvement in Presbyterian controversies of the 1920s, he'd earned a reputation as the nation's most learned and articulate defender of traditional Protestantism. But Machen's respect went beyond Machen's credentials to the argument, which the journalist judged was completely impregnable. If he is wrong, Machen wrote, then the science of logic is a hollow vanity, signifying nothing. And we might add that Machen's New Testament introduction, though short, and we don't like it as well as Theodore Zahn, but it is short, concise, compact, in the sense, I call it Packerian, after James Innes Packer. Prof. Packer had this capacity to condense things down into just a super dense, compact argument with witty, strong statements. That's Packer. Well, Prof. Machen, his New Testament introduction, has that same sensibility. Only the essence is evident in his New Testament introduction. Not driven all over the map like you get with some other books. The way in which both Lippmann and Mencken exempted Machen from their otherwise dismissive critique of 20th century Protestantism poses an important question. How could Machen's religious and cultural convictions serve both as ammunition for modernists to criticize the mainstream church and as a foundation from which to defend Protestant orthodoxy? The lengthy parade of anomalies in Machen's career made this question even more pressing. These quirks may even extend so far as to suggest that religion and modern culture in the early 20th century were more complicated than had been assumed. In the Presbyterian Church, Machen wanted to enforce strictly the details of Calvinistic orthodoxy, yet in society he wanted an ardent libertarian. He was an ardent libertarian who opposed the efforts of government to impose anything. He published writings that defended the historical reliability of the New Testament, yet Machen also championed the methods of modern biblical scholarship. He opposed the secularization of life in America. It did not oppose the teaching of evolution. He railed against the biblical scholarship of mainstream Protestantism, yet published with an established New York firm a grammar of New Testament Greek that was widely used at institutions of his religious foes. Like conventional fundamentalists, Machen opposed the growth of the federal government, but very much unlike his fundamentalists, he attacked prohibition. Like later fundamentalists, Machen advocated for private Christian schools, yet unlike many later fundamentalists, he opposed Bible reading and prayer in public schools. Well, Machen, like Southern Protestants, was a segregationist who opposed the admission of black students to Princeton Seminary. Yet as a proponent of cultural pluralism, he championed bilingual primary and secondary school education in ethnic communities. Like other fundamentalists, he opposed women's suffrage, but at the same time, unlike Northern Protestants, Machen was a lifelong member of the Democratic Party. And in 1928, he was one of the few Protestants, Northern or Southern, to vote for the first Roman Catholic presidential candidate, Al Smith. Well, we'll bring that to an end here. Machen. verse 2 of hymn 672. Our hopes are weak, our fears are strong, thick darkness blinds our eyes. Cold as the night, thy people long that thou, their sunlight, would rise. Let us pray. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.